my opinion only. It's the United Nations who said this is what was going on. They wanted to cleanse that area. They wanted to push out the Muslim. Why don't we realize one of the factors is that we've moved to a democracy?
You following the situation during conflict, they have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How the findings of the report could be implementing in the reality and really fulfill the victims' right?
Subscribe, like, dan nyalakan loncengnya.
Yeah, we heard about the work of Asia Justice and Rights, the regional NGOs, working on promoting the accountability in Asia. Would you like to share about the work of Asia Justice and Rights and how their work on promoting the situation in Asia, human rights situation in Asia?
Terima kasih Ibu Indri dan juga terima kasih atas kesempatan bicara bersama dengan kalian hari ini. Tapi mungkin saya bicara bahasa Inggris ya?
Yeah.
Okay, terima kasih. So, about 14 years ago, we formed Asia Justice and Rights. The acronym is AJAR, which of course means to teach or to learn in Indonesian and Malayu. And when we decided what was the most important thing that we could work on, we were looking for the gaps, the things that aren't done very well. And we thought our friends in the big human rights organizations and the national organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Contrast, and the other organizations that are our friends, do a great job of investigating, naming and shaming when it needs to be done, speaking the truth to power. But for AJAR, what we saw was missing is building the capacity, helping those human rights defenders, victims organizations, government actors who are looking for positive change to be able to be more effective in working for human rights. So AJAR decided to focus a lot of its work on capacity building because the way that we look at our impact is that every person who comes to one of our trainings or who we mentor or who gets connected to others, when they finish that process, all of the work that they do is part of the impact of that increased capacity. So that can go on. And one of the great things is that human rights defenders and victims, survivors, are often engaged in this work for the rest of their life. So if we can just help them to be more effective, to know more, and to link to each other, then that work is going to be effective. And why did we choose accountability as the main thing that we want to work on? Well, we need accountability for everything in the society. If you want to improve your schools or your hospitals, childcare, and the money is being spent for people's personal houses or planes or their families, then you're not going to get as many hospitals. The cost of this lack of accountability is direct in terms of the benefits to the community and in those societies where we've experienced mass killing, rape and torture, the worst situations, what are the chances that that government will be accountable for delivering the hospitals and the schools if they're not accountable for mass murder? So we have to start with the most serious things. And if people know that they're going to be held to account when they use their power to lock someone up just because they criticize them, or to kill someone who's an opponent or who's opposing a commercial activity, if they know there's no accountability, what's to stop them doing it again? And when we see situations like we've experienced in Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, Myanmar, across the region, where there have been thousands of people killed, raped and tortured, it's only because there was impunity and no accountability that the first few cases were able to lead on. 3 cases becomes 10, becomes 100, becomes 1,000, because the perpetrators know that the truth is not going to be uncovered and they're not going to be held to account. So it's part of our job to uncover the truth, to use that truth to design what needs to be done to help the society to be more accountable and to empower those fantastic human rights defenders and victims so that they can do a more effective job. It's a big job, and it's a difficult one. But without it, if we don't work on accountability, what my experience is over 30 years is that the cycles of violence just begin again and again and again, because the root causes are still there.
Yeah, I believe this kind of situation is quite massive in Asia, and Aceh probably one of them. Yeah. So, which areas that AJAR work on this kind of situation?
Yes, Aceh has experienced 30 years of a very terrible conflict, and the people here, and it's great to be in Aceh working with the Acehnese once again, have shown great courage and also great wisdom in demonstrating that they can move out of this cycle of violence. It's now nearly 20 years since the peace agreement, and we have peace. And that's why when people say, oh, everything is terrible and there's nothing good happening. And then I was just reflecting yesterday when I was training some of the local participants that we have peace in Aceh. Next week I'll be in Timor-Leste. We have peace in Timor-Leste. The group we were working with yesterday is from Mindanao in the Philippines. They have peace now. Those three contexts that we're working on this week all took a lot of work, and maintaining the peace takes a lot of work, but it's not that it always fails. It's just that it's a long and difficult process. So AJAR, we quite often use a framework that's called the Transitional Justice Framework. And this is a concept that developed since the 1990s and is accepted by the United Nations, the European Union, and many countries around the world as a very useful tool and standards to help us deal with a transition from dictatorship, mass atrocity, to peace and democracy. And what the Transitional Justice Framework means, to me, it really was summed up by Kofi Annan when he was the Secretary General of the United Nations. And in basic terms, he said that transitional justice is all of the things that a society does to deal with its history of mass violations, including four things, including prosecution of those most responsible, bringing out the truth-seeking, reparation or helping the victims to repair their lives, and reforming the institutions and the society, perhaps discrimination, the legal system, the security forces, those reforms that need to be undertaken to stop the violence happening again. So AJAR very often uses that framework to help us to decide how and where we work. Our head office is in Jakarta. We have about 20 staff there in quite a significant office, and it's strategic because it's also the Secretariat of ASEAN. We have an office in Timor-Leste. I myself spent 6 years in Timor-Leste, and we continue to do that work to make sure that the consciousness of human rights is still there. We work with university students, with victims of the past conflict, and the statistics are there were between 100,000 and 200,000 who died during that conflict. There are many victims that we still work with, particularly women victims of sexual violations. And we have a program right now with about 400 of those women victims to give them assistance, to link them to each other, to help them to heal, and to promote the base of rights so that this doesn't happen to others. So we have the headquarters in Jakarta, the office in Timor-Leste, and we're doing a lot of work. We tend to focus on the most serious challenges and the most difficult places. So right now in our region, Burma is a very terrible situation. In 2021, following an election that was judged to be free and fair by the European Union and other observers, and in that election, the NLD party won more than 80% of the votes. But the military decided they didn't want that fair election to be the basis for the democracy, and they just came in and said, all government officials, you either accept to work for us, all ministers, you resign right now. They took over the whole country, and they believed that they could do that because they've done it in the past. And in 70 years since their independence, the military's been in power for all but about 10 years. But that 10 years between 2011 and 2021, the young people and the society had a taste of democracy. They experienced what it's like to live in a more free society where you can criticize your government, where we're all in this process to try and make things better. And they've rejected the military completely, which means now that there's a massive war going on across the country with all kinds of groups fighting back against the military, the illegal military junta. More than 200,000 government employees have given up their jobs and their hopes for security because they feel they could not work for that military junta. So imagine government employees. Many of them join because that they want security. They have their life mapped out, but they feel they cannot work for the junta, so they've left. 200,000 university students, hundreds of thousands have not finished their studies. Artists, lawyers, doctors, musicians have all picked up guns or been part of the peaceful resistance. So
people movement,
a people's movement to reject authoritarian rule. And many of those people say, we just can't accept this for our children and our grandchildren. So AJAR has quite a significant team from Burma working on these issues from the Thai-Burma border area because it's no longer safe to work inside the country. And we also have a significant team that's been working full-time for the last 5 years in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. They're also victims of the Myanmar military junta. In 2017, the junta attacked the Rohingya people who live in the western part of Burma, Myanmar, and the UN called that a classic case of ethnic cleansing. So it's not my opinion only, it's the United Nations who said this is what was going on. They wanted to cleanse that area. They wanted to push out the Muslim population of Rohingya from that western part of Myanmar. So they've been persecuted because they're Muslim, because they're Rohingya. Some of them are turning up here now in Aceh on boats in desperate condition. They've been persecuted because of their religion, and we hope that they will receive a humanitarian reception by others who share some common base with them. So our team, the refugees, in that 3-week period in 2017, the Burmese military killed more than 10,000 Rohingya, raped many hundreds of women, burned down more than hundreds of villages. And they were forced to run out of the country, and they now live under plastic sheeting. 1.5 million people in the largest refugee camp in the world in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So our team works through, we have about 200 trained facilitators now. Many of them are women survivors of sexual violence and other violence. And they are engaged in teaching and sharing knowledge about human rights, justice, so that the Rohingya themselves can take a meaningful part in the decisions that are made about them. And we very strongly believe in the principle, nothing about us without us. So if we are dealing with the Rohingya issue, it should involve the Rohingya. But for them to be involved in this complex discussion about their future, they need to understand refugee law, human rights law, the political situation, and how they can be more effective. So we're helping them to have a more effective voice, both from individuals to have a more effective voice in their communities and with the broader community.
So among you say about the framework of transitional justice, yeah? So, to what extent that you think that revealing the truth is important, and how is our work on whether you have the work with the truth mechanism in countries, and how is the effective work of this kind of institution as well?
In every situation of mass conflict, those who've been involved as perpetrators will say, oh, this is in the past now, let's not look at it, let's go forward, and we don't need to look at the past, it's just digging up old wounds. If it were true that human beings could move on and let our past go completely, then that would be much simpler. But it's actually just not true. And we have to deal with what's true. And I often ask our participants in trainings, imagine if it was your daughter who was raped and killed, or your son was taken away and tortured until he was dead, or your husband or your wife. Will you now just say, oh, that's in the past and let's move on? That's not what human beings do. That's not who we are. And we have to deal with who we are. So, and also when I've experienced more than 30 countries in serious violent conflict, I see that they all are not one-off occurrences. They have conflict and mass violations, and then it stops for a while, it comes back again, it stops for a while, it comes back again. And one of the reasons is that if we don't reveal the truth about what really happened and why it happened, it will just repeat again. If the root causes are a lack of accountability, impunity for the powerful, corruption, a deep discrimination in the society against minorities, if they're the root causes and we achieve peace, those root causes will develop again and sprout again into violence. And when we have violence, we can't have development. Companies won't come and invest. There's no security of contracts if the legal system isn't working well. And so that's why we see that the countries that are peaceful develop and become wealthy, and the countries which constantly are involved in violence remain poor. So we need to work on the truth, because the truth of what happened to people, who were the victims, which institutions or individuals were responsible, what were the patterns and how they could do that, why were they not arrested and brought to the legal system, they're the things that we need to know so that we can stop this happening again. So the truth, uncovering and sharing the truth, is at the root of all of this work. And the way that we do that, I mean, there are many people involved in uncovering the truth in an unofficial way. Journalists, non-government organizations, victims organizations, they write down the stories and statements of those who've been victims. They advocate for change. And then we have official mechanisms like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a Human Rights Commission. The UN is setting up bodies such as the IIMM for Myanmar, and also for Syria and other places where they have a mandate to gather the truth and the evidence to prepare for prosecutions. So that's why the truth is very important. We can't fix something if we don't know that it's broken and we don't know why it's broken. Imagine that, if we had an analogy to your car and your cousin was the mechanic and your car kept breaking down, and you kept saying, oh no, but it can't be the mechanic put the wrong part in, because you just keep denying that. You're never going to fix your car. If the mechanic is responsible for putting in the second-hand part that's broken and the car keeps breaking down, we need to know the truth. And it doesn't matter that he's my cousin. Otherwise, the car will always be broken. And the same for these situations in countries. Very often it's the leaders and their families and their cronies who have been involved in mass theft. They've used the violence and the guns so they can take a large portion of the country's wealth, and that wealth belongs to the people and should be used for schools and hospitals and roads. So sometimes they justify it like this is just what we do. But we have to look at it that that's costing the lives of babies, the education of our children, because they're taking the money that should have been spent on schools and hospitals. So if that goes on, then very often those leaders start to be criticized. They're stealing too much. So the ones, what do? They don't want to hear the voices of those who criticize them. So they use their connection and their power with the police and the military to lock up those people who criticize, who oppose them. And they torture, kill them often. And then because there's impunity, nobody is arrested. And this is the same pattern that you see in Latin America and Africa, across the world, across Asia, the same patterns of people abusing power, using the security forces to stifle opposition. And then that destroys the legal system because the judges then become the tool and you cannot develop. So leaders and those involved in this across the region are guaranteeing that their country will remain poor. They have to realize that it's the rule of law, one law for everybody, transparency and accountability. That's the basis for the well-being of their people. And that means being able to be criticized. If you look at the more developed, wealthy countries across Europe, the UK, France, Germany, the United States, Australia, every day the newspapers are full of criticism of the government. They have to be not afraid to be criticized. Sometimes it's unjustified, sometimes it's true, but it keeps the government working well. And you will see in poor countries, they don't tolerate criticism. But criticism is actually good for us when it's well-founded. And we need to be able to deal with those who hold us to account, who say you shouldn't have spent that money on your family, it was supposed to be spent on a hospital. So this is why accountability and the truth are linked and are so important to moving from a situation of mass atrocity to peace and sustainable peace, which is the base for development. And you see here in Aceh, wandering around Banda yesterday, when I compare it to more than 20 years ago during the conflict period, people are better off, they're happier, they're freer. So moving into situations where you become more accountability, where you uncover the truth, it can be uncomfortable, but it's necessary for freedom and development.
So in this kind of situation, how is the role of civil society? How we can build the solidarity among Asian countries, for example, because the situation is almost the same currently. Yeah, I mean, we face the democratic situation, better life, but we also can face now the political situation in the Philippines, in Indonesia, probably after October, or it's already started now. So what do you think about building the solidarity between the civil society?
The role of civil society is absolutely crucial in moving a society forward in terms of democracy and freedom. And that democracy and freedom is the basis for economic development as well. And when we see these leaders say, oh, but we need to suspend the rights and we have to clamp down on those who are criticizing us because we want to develop economically, it's simply not true. There's not the evidence for that. When we look around the world and we see the countries where the military had a significant role in government, they're all a mess. There were 11 military dictatorships in Latin America during the 70s to the 90s. In all 11, there were mass atrocities committed against those who opposed them. The economy fell into disruption. The military are very important for our society as a defense role. They should not be involved in the civilian life. And our experience across the world is that doesn't work. Because when you involve the people with guns, in very sensitive processes of power and power sharing, Nobody can share with the one if he's got a gun and you don't. So it distorts everything. So when we see a return to the role of guns in civilian democracies, we know that doesn't work, and we know where that leads. How do we know it? Because in 100% of the cases around the world, it's led to a disaster. And even within these cultures, if we look back in the history of Indonesia and we see what happened, the mass atrocities that were committed in Indonesia in the 1960s, in the 1970s and 80s, during the purges in Aceh, in East Timor, in Papua, in Poso, in Maluku. Now, actually, it's much better. Why don't we realize one of the factors is that we've moved to a democracy and we have more rights, and civil society has had a much stronger voice. This is not an accident that Indonesia now has a much greater peace and is developing well, and civil society is strong. That's not accidental. They have contributed to this. By winding back on civil society, you're going to wind back to another era in which people were afraid, in which people couldn't criticize the government, and in which money and the resources that belong to the people for schools and hospitals end up in the pockets of people who don't deserve that and their families. So that's why civil society, when we talk about civil society, we're talking about very often organizations and people who are very committed to improving their country. And they are very committed to the truth. They're committed to justice. And when we think, oh, well, let's squash that, we don't want truth or justice, then we have to think about what do we want? If we're saying we don't want truth and justice, then we want lies and injustice. Why? So certain people can get a bigger portion of the national resources for themselves than they deserve. The salary might be X amount. They don't want their salary. They want a lot of bribes as well, or they want their family to be appointed into senior positions. This is the type of culture that we have across Africa, in some of the Latin American countries that are constantly in conflict. It's not the culture that you have in Europe, US, Australia, and other countries where that level of accountability is higher and there's more for all the people. The education systems are better. The economy is better. So that's why we need civil society, because who else is going to bring out the truth?
Yeah.
The government, if the government is involved in these issues, they need someone else to help them to do a good job. And that's why I think governments need to see civil society as their friends who will help them to do a good job. They can, when my wife tells me I'm doing something wrong, I might get angry, but actually then I have to think, well, maybe I was doing something wrong and I changed my behavior. We don't like to hear that, but we need it to do a better job. And so civil society's role in very often monitoring, seeing what's happening, how the money's being spent, because the money doesn't belong to the money belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to the leaders. The leaders have a set amount that they should be paid. It's in their contract. The additional funds don't belong to them. They belong to schools and medical clinics. So that needs to be monitored. Civil society also developed a lot of skill in many other ways, international law, in the regional interactions, and they can also help to teach their friends, other civil society and government people, and sharing experiences from both. So I'm a very big supporter in government and civil society working much closer together. And when I find that we have events where there are government and civil society, they love it. Actually, both sides. It's a great opportunity. They find out that those who they didn't know are really great people, that they're working hard. We just need to know each other a bit better and realize that we're working for the same things.
Small opportunity, but has to be taken by.
That's right.
Okay, I think the last part is about Aceh itself. You following the situation during conflict, then they have a peace process, and now they have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Of course, this is also because of the long advocacy by the civil society, and during the establishment up to now, the civil society also engaged in that part. And AJAR also supporting this process for the strengthening survivors, civil society, and the TRC itself. So the TRC already established the new report, the new findings report, based on the experiences from the other countries. For example, what is the strategy? How the findings of the report could be implementing in the reality and really fulfill the victims' right? Do you have any suggestion on that and how it be works?
I think, I've worked a lot on Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in a number of countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And I think it's good to understand the Aceh Truth and Reconciliation Commission is one of about 50 that have been held in different countries around the world. And a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is usually only established once in a context. And it's an effort to do a really intensive study of what has happened and to learn from that. Now, when you've had mass killing, rape, and torture like they did in Aceh, that's going to be a difficult truth to look at. You're going to look at the truth in relating to people killing each other, raping, and torturing. But the reason why we need to do that, as I've said before, is that, every country also should have a true history of what happened in their country, in their region. Nobody really wants to say, well, we're going to establish something which is lies and say that's our history. Also, the reasons why this happened need to be understood or they'll happen again. And one of the great quotes, I think, from a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust said, because it happened, it can happen. Because those things happen in Aceh, it can happen. And a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the one opportunity that we have in these different contexts to gather the true stories from victims and witnesses to what has taken place. Usually that truth will have been denied, distorted, washed over by propaganda. So do we want propaganda and something which is not true? Do we want that? Or do we want actually to know actually what happened? That truth will be uncomfortable, but it is really important for us to move forward. For example, if we see what were the root causes of the conflict, then we can keep a close eye to make sure when they grow again that we realize what the cost is going to be. In Aceh, I believe they took the statements of about 5,000 victims. In Timor-Leste, the Truth Commission took 8,000 statements from victims. In South Africa, they took 20,000 victim statements. And then with that number of true statements from victims who are very unlikely to not tell the truth, we can get a clear picture of what happened, who was involved, why it happened. And then we can form strategies to stop it happening again. If it was that certain actors were not held to account when they started to use violence, and we see that again, actors starting to use violence and not being held to account, we need to say, look, it led to 30,000 people dying before. Let's stop that before it happens again. But if we don't look at the truth of the past and they start to use violence again to achieve their political goals or whatever else, then that's just going to unfold. We need to keep focused on the truth of the past so that it doesn't repeat itself. And I think I haven't seen yet the Aceh Truth Commission report, but I think in general, one of the key issues for truth commissions is to share that knowledge as widely as possible and courageously to look at what's happened and realize that there were mistakes made. We all make mistakes, and we should allow that to be uncovered and say, okay, look, in the past, different groups may have made mistakes. We made mistakes. Let's learn from our mistakes and create a better future. The alternative is, oh no, we deny, we didn't make any mistakes, this didn't happen. And then the future is worse because it happens again. So let's look at the past courageously. Identify the mistakes, learn from those mistakes. And when we start to see those factors developing again, whether it's the involvement of international corporations, whether it's the use of guns, whether it's corruption, whether it's the abuse of power, when we look at that and we say, well, that was here in the past and it led to 30,000 people being killed and poverty for the region, let's look at that. And only that truth can help us to identify when these factors start to emerge again. So it's very important that we learn from the past, admit our mistakes, create a better future, and use the truth as the basis for that.
So you're sure that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings could be contributing for the sustaining peace in Aceh?
I haven't seen them yet, but I think that's a very important thing, to look at the findings. These commissioners who were chosen and appointed to do this job for a number of years, the hard work of all the civil society who went out and interviewed more than 5,000 people, who researched all the things that had gone on. This is a very valuable tool if we want to know really what happened. Or do we want to pretend that something else happened? That's the question for us. Do we really want to know? And knowing what happened doesn't mean that we're still doing it. It means that if things were bad, and they were bad in every context, it means that we made mistakes. And it means that we can fix our mistakes. If we don't look at it and look at those findings, we can't fix the mistakes and it'll happen again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming to Aceh.
And I must say, this Achenese coffee is, I think, some of the best in the world. So, I have a song on Spotify. I'm also a singer. So my song is called Patrick Burgess. You can see it on Spotify, Coffee, Coffee, Coffee. And I now have the Achenese coffee. Fantastic.
Do you want to change the title to Achenese coffee? No.
Maybe I should change it to Aceh, Coffee, 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 Aceh.
Okay.
Because it's wonderful coffee here from Aceh.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pak Patrick. Really nice to see you, and thank you for your contributing for the human rights in Indonesia.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Terima kasih banyak atas kesempatan untuk hadir di sini hari ini, dan ya, saya lihat ke depan untuk kerja bersama-sama lagi di masa depan. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.
Jika video ini bermanfaat untuk Anda, silakan subscribe, like, dan nyalakan loncengnya.